Afghanistan in 2002, and you were called into a very remote section, something coming out of the cave, and it's moving with a speed and agility that catches you off.
Few stories to emerge from the long years of America's war in Afghanistan have gripped public imagination quite like this one. It does not involve a famous battle, a celebrated general, or a decisive military operation. It involves a cave, a missing patrol, and a creature that, if the accounts are to be believed, should not exist at all. The story is known today as the Kandahar Giant Mystery, and despite more than 2 decades of official denials, anonymous testimonies, internet debates, and independent investigations, it refuses to go away. So what actually happened? What can be verified? And what does the full picture, examined honestly and without sensationalism, actually reveal? That is what this video is going to explore, because the real story of the Kandahar Giant is far more layered, and in some ways far more fascinating than the legend itself. To understand where this story comes from, we need to start at the beginning, and that means going back to 2002 in the mountains of Kandahar Province, Afghanistan. The United States military was deep into Operation Enduring Freedom. The campaign launched following the September 11th attacks. American forces were conducting patrols across some of the most remote and inhospitable terrain on Earth. Rugged mountain ranges, hidden valleys, and cave systems that had sheltered fighters for decades. It was in this environment. That distinction matters, not to diminish the people who have served in Afghanistan, but to respect them. Real soldiers faced real dangers in those mountains, and some of them died in ways that were fully documented and officially acknowledged, like Sergeant First Class Daniel Romero. Their stories deserve to be told accurately. When unverifiable legends compete with documented history for attention, it is always the documented history that suffers. The Kandahar Giant story has circulated for 2 decades because it satisfies something deep in the human appetite for mystery and explanation. That appetite is not shameful, it is human. But satisfying it responsibly means following the evidence wherever it leads. And in this case, the evidence leads not to a cave in Afghanistan, but to the storytelling traditions, psychological realities, and cultural anxieties of people navigating an incomprehensible war. So the mystery has been solved, not with a dramatic revelation about what really lurks in the Afghan mountains, but with something arguably more revealing. An understanding of what we reach for when the world stops making sense, and why the oldest stories we know have a way of finding new homes in every generation's darkest and most uncertain hours. The connection to the Nephilim tradition deserves particular examination here, because it is central to how the story has been framed and why it resonates with specific audiences. In Genesis 6 and Numbers 13, the biblical text does reference beings of unusual size, described as inhabitants of Canaan who inspired fear in the Israelite scouts sent to survey the land. Biblical historians and scholars have extensively analyzed these passages, and the mainstream academic consensus is that the Nephilim references are metaphorical or mythological in nature, not historical documentation of a literal race of 15-foot giants. The physical characteristics attributed to the Kandahar giant, 6 fingers, double teeth, red hair, closely mirror the Nephilim descriptions that circulate in certain religious and conspiratorial communities, which itself suggests that the story was constructed around those pre-existing templates rather than emerging independently from a genuine encounter. What the full picture actually reveals, then, is this: the Kandahar Giant mystery is not a mystery about a creature. It is a mystery about how stories work, how they are born in the interplay between genuine human experience and pre-existing myth, how they spread through networks of anonymous testimony and social media amplification, and how they take on a life entirely independent of any factual foundation. The war in Afghanistan was real. The mountains of Kandahar are real. The stress, the danger, and the psychological weight carried by soldiers who served there are real. The caves are real, and so is the history of Afghanistan as a landscape rich with ancient stories about forces beyond human understanding. What is not real, at least not in any documented, verifiable sense, is a 13-foot red-haired giant with 6 fingers and a spear who killed American soldiers and was quietly airlifted away by faceless operatives. Certain caves and mountain zones, describing them as the domain of dangerous forces. When American soldiers arrived in Afghanistan, young men and women navigating extreme stress, sleep deprivation, cultural unfamiliarity, and genuine mortal danger, they stepped into a landscape already saturated with these stories. Combat psychologists and military historians have long documented the tendency of soldiers under pressure to experience perceptual distortions and to interpret ambiguous or frightening events through the frameworks available to them, whether cultural, religious, or folkloric. There is also the broader phenomenon of military folklore itself. Every prolonged conflict generates stories, accounts of strange lights, unexplained sounds, anomalous experiences that soldiers struggle to categorize or explain. These stories serve a psychological function. They give shape and meaning to the formless strangeness of war in alien environments. The Kandahar giant fits squarely within this tradition. It takes the genuine chaos and horror of combat in Afghanistan, the missing patrols, the hidden caves, the uncertainty, the violence, and wraps it in a narrative framework that is ancient and symbolically powerful. Giants lurking in caves, slain by warriors, their secrets guarded by those in authority. This is one of humanity's oldest story templates, appearing in cultures from ancient Mesopotamia to medieval Europe. The Kandahar giant is, in this sense, less a report of a specific incident than a modern iteration of a story human beings have been telling about war and the unknown for thousands of years. So where does that leave us? The honest answer is that the Kandahar giant, as a literal creature that fought and killed American soldiers in 2002, does not survive basic factual scrutiny. There is no verifiable evidence. Not a single photograph, document, flight log entry, corroborated eyewitness account, or piece of physical material that supports the claim. Every source traces back to anonymous testimony. Every attempt to identify the soldiers involved reaches a dead end. The only named individuals connected to the story, Quayle and Marzulli, are both figures with long track records of promoting biblical and paranormal narratives that connect ancient scripture to modern events. That context matters enormously when evaluating their credibility as primary sources for a military incident. And yet, the story persists. And understanding why it persists is genuinely worth exploring, because it tells us something real and important. Afghanistan's cultural and historical landscape is deeply saturated with traditions involving large, dangerous supernatural beings. The region's folklore includes references to jinn, divs, and other powerful entities said to inhabit caves and remote mountain areas. The Quran references a people called the people of Ad, sometimes described in terms suggesting great physical size. Local Afghan traditions, passed down through generations, warn against entering. When Snopes, the well-established fact-checking organization, investigated the claims in 2016, they contacted the United States Department of Defense directly. The response was unambiguous. A Department of Defense spokesman stated that they had no record or information about a Special Forces member being killed by a giant in Kandahar. No press releases, no mission logs, no casualty reports, no personnel records. Nothing in official documentation supported the story in any form. The Military Times similarly investigated and classified the account as unverified folklore, noting that the story rested entirely on anonymous sources whose identities could not be confirmed. These are not obscure or unreliable outlets dismissing a legitimate claim. These are mainstream institutions applying standard journalistic and investigative methods to a specific set of assertions and finding no supporting evidence whatsoever. The question of Dan is particularly instructive. Researchers who attempted to trace this soldier through official casualty records found only one soldier named Dan who died in Kandahar in 2002. Sergeant First Class Daniel Romero, a member of the 3rd Special Forces Group. Romero was killed on October 28, 2002, along with 3 other soldiers in a bomb blast, not by a spear-wielding giant in a mountain cave. His death is documented, publicly acknowledged, and entirely explained by the known circumstances of combat in Afghanistan at that time. The absence of any other Dan in the casualty records for Kandahar during that period does not prove a cover-up. It is precisely what we would expect to find if the story were not based in documented fact. Now here is where we need to slow down and be honest about what the evidence actually shows, because this is where the story gets genuinely interesting. Not because the giant was real, but because of what the story reveals about how legends are born, how they spread, and why they endure. The tale first entered public circulation in the mid-2000s, when radio host Steve Quayle recounted it on the late-night program Coast AM, a show famous for its coverage of paranormal and fringe topics. It gained significantly wider attention in 2016 when filmmaker Marzulli included a dramatized account in his documentary series, featuring an interview with an anonymous individual he called Mr. K, who claimed to have witnessed the encounter firsthand. Marzulli, a Christian author and filmmaker whose work consistently ties modern events to biblical prophecy, framed the creature as a Nephilim, the race of giant beings referenced in the Book of Genesis and the Book of Numbers as the offspring of fallen angels and human women. From that point, the story exploded across the internet, spreading through YouTube channels, Reddit threads, conspiracy forums, and paranormal podcasts. That the story allegedly unfolded. According to accounts that would later circulate widely, a U.S. military patrol went missing while on a routine mission in a remote mountain region near Kandahar. When radio contact was lost and the unit failed to report in, a special operations team was dispatched to investigate. What they allegedly found at the site, scattered military equipment, human remains inside a cave, and a confrontation with a massive humanoid creature, would become the basis for one of the most persistent military legends of the modern era. The creature described across multiple retellings shares consistent physical characteristics. It was said to stand somewhere between 12 and 15 feet tall, with flaming red hair, 6 fingers on each hand, a double row of teeth, and extraordinary physical strength. According to the core version of the story, the giant attacked the team, killed a soldier referred to only as Dan with a crude spear-like weapon, and was ultimately brought down after a sustained burst of gunfire, including shots from a high-caliber sniper rifle. The body was then allegedly recovered and airlifted out on a military transport helicopter by personnel who wore no identifying insignia and said nothing to the surviving soldiers. Shortly after, the story goes, all those involved were separated, interrogated, and made to sign non-disclosure agreements. The incident was erased from official records, and the creature vanished into the machinery of government secrecy.